Okay, so we're going to start, being 9:02. We're going to start. Please remember that simultaneous translation Spanish, English, Spanish is being provided for this event. You just need to click on the icon of a globe at the bottom of your screen and select the language for which you need interpretation. This event is also being streamed on LinkedIn. Queridos amigos, les recuerdo que este evento cuenta con traducción simultánea español-inglés, inglés-español, para la que solo tienen que elegir el idioma para el que quieren traducción en la imagen de globo en la parte inferior de sus pantallas. Y también les cuento que esta actividad está siendo transmitida en vivo en LinkedIn. Buenos días y gracias por sumarse a otro de nuestros seminarios digitales, con el que volvemos a abordar los prospectos para las relaciones entre China y Estados Unidos y las consecuencias de ese escenario para nuestro país. A nadie escapa todo lo que está en juego para el mundo entero, muy en especial para los países pequeños y medianos como el nuestro. El devenir del comercio global, crítico para países como Chile, depende en gran medida de los derroteros que tome la vinculación entre Washington y Beijing. Por esto, ahora que comenzamos un año que, al menos sobre el papel, abre el camino para que ambas potencias sostengan hasta 4 encuentros de alto nivel, incluidas 2 visitas de Estado recíprocas, quizás el acuerdo más relevante hasta ahora, nos ha parecido adecuado sostener otro diálogo para analizar, en la medida en que eso es posible en el mundo de hoy, los puntos más relevantes. Llevamos adelante esta sesión, además, en momentos de intensa reafirmación del interés estadounidense por ejercer influencia en el continente americano, lo que en la doctrina de seguridad de Washington históricamente es entendido como el hemisferio occidental. Esto se produce, sin embargo, luego de años de incremento e intensificación de la presencia china en buena parte de los países latinoamericanos, tanto por la vía del comercio como de las inversiones en sectores cada vez más estratégicos y a través también de políticas crediticias. Las consecuencias de la rivalidad sino-estadounidense en Chile y el vecindario regional permanece así como uno de los elementos más significativos de la relación más general entre las dos potencias. En un plano más global, tenemos por una parte el programa insignia de China para el financiamiento de infraestructuras estratégicas en el extranjero, la iniciativa de la Franja de la Ruta, conocida como the Belt and Road Initiative, que aumentó en 3/4 partes sus inversiones en el año 2025, cuando llegó a una cifra récord de 213.500 billones de dólares. Y por otra parte, tenemos a la Casa Blanca, que ha incorporado plenamente la política comercial como una palanca de presión para conseguir mejores condiciones de acceso a mercados extranjeros, incluso en aquellos con los que históricamente ha mantenido superávits, como es el caso de Chile, y para la consecución de objetivos geopolíticos. El hecho es que cada uno, con sus propias estrategias, se esfuerza por expandir su influencia mientras sigue pendiente un acuerdo marco para sus lazos bilaterales. Un pacto así debería disminuir los focos de fricción, generar un poco más de predictibilidad y sentar las bases de un orden que, si bien alejado del sistema basado en reglas que conocimos hasta hace poco, permita construir cierto grado de confianza. Es evidente que el mundo, y países como Chile en particular, se juega muchísimo en este desenlace. De todo esto, así como con seguridad de otros muchos asuntos, conversaremos durante esta actividad, para la que volvemos a contar con panelistas de clase mundial, consumados expertos en la materia que nos ocupa y que paso a presentar. Por un lado tenemos a Iacob Koch-Weser, espero haberlo pronunciado bien. Es director asociado de la práctica Global Advantage del Boston Consulting Group, conocido como BCG, especializado en geopolítica, mercados emergentes y comercio e inversión. Desde su incorporación al BCG en el 2019, Iacob ha apoyado a clientes corporativos en temas como riesgo geopolítico, aranceles, controles de exportación, normativa digital e impuestos fronterizos al carbono. También ha apoyado a clientes del sector público en temas como la promoción del comercio y la inversión, zonas económicas especiales y organismos internacionales. Antes de unirse al BCG, Iacob trabajó en la oficina del representante comercial de Estados Unidos, conocido como el USTR por sus siglas en inglés, donde dirigió un equipo que analizaba las políticas económicas y comerciales de China para fundamentar las acciones comerciales de Estados Unidos. También fue analista de la Comisión de Revisión Económica y de Seguridad entre Estados Unidos y China del Congreso de Estados Unidos. Por otra parte, tenemos a Andrew Polk, quien es cofundador y director de investigación económica de Trivium China, prestigiosa firma de asesoría estratégica. Antes de fundar Trivium, Andrew fue director para China en Medley Global Advisors, donde asesoró a gestoras de activos y fondos de cobertura sobre la evolución de la economía y los mercados financieros de China. Anteriormente fue economista residente para China en el Centro de China de The Conference Board en Beijing, donde realizó análisis económicos sobre la economía china para clientes corporativos. Es coautor de La larga y suave caída del crecimiento chino y mantiene una sólida red de contactos profesionales en las comunidades de gobierno, académica y empresarial de China. Otros puestos de investigación que ha desempeñado incluyen periodos en el Instituto de Finanzas Internacionales y en el Departamento del Tesoro de Estados Unidos. Y finalmente, pero no por ello menos importante, tenemos a Robert Funk, quien es profesor asociado de Ciencia Política de la Facultad de Gobierno de la Universidad de Chile, de la cual fue subdirector entre el 2009 y el 2012. Es comentarista y columnista en radio y televisión, tanto nacional como internacionalmente, y fue presidente de la Asociación Chilena de Ciencia Política entre el 2006 y el 2008. También ha sido investigador invitado en la Universidad de Miami y el Center for Strategic and International Studies en Washington, D.C. Durante más de 20 años ha realizado consultorías en riesgo político, mapeo de actores y acompañamiento especializándose en Chile y América Latina para clientes principalmente ubicados en Wall Street. Sin más, entonces le voy a ceder la palabra al primero de nuestros invitados, que será Iacob, a quien le seguirán Andrew y finalmente Robert. Y desde ya los invito a que hagan sus preguntas o comentarios en cualquier momento de la actividad, para lo que pueden utilizar la función de preguntas y respuestas en la parte baja de sus pantallas o el icono de chat. Entonces, sin más, Iacob, you have the floor and you can share the screen if you want. And thank you so much again for accepting our invitation.
Great. Well, thank you, Loreto. If everyone can see the screen, I think we're ready to go on my end. So thank you again for this great opportunity to appear at such an esteemed event with esteemed colleagues. What I'll do today is briefly walk through some of BCG's latest thinking on the global forces and geopolitics that are shaping business this year with a U.S.-China relations perspective. So just looking sort of more specifically at that issue to meet our theme today. And just on a personal note, adding to what Loreto said, I've been sort of observing China for over 2 decades, starting when I first lived there in Beijing about in the early 2000s. And really in the time since, China has seen, of course, tremendous growth. And I've been able, both in the public sector at the US Congress and USTR, to kind of watch how Washington sees China and how that's evolving. And subsequently, in the last half decade or so at BCG, working with clients on sort of, one might say, troubleshooting their business in China, which for many of them, of course, remains a very important market and important place where they make and source their products and services. So hopefully some of those personal perspectives will also inform what I discuss here today. And of course, very excited to discuss with the audience and with my fellow panelists after the presentation as well. So with that note, this is the overall framework of how BCG is thinking about these major forces in 2026. On the left-hand side, you see the sort of multipolar geopolitics, which are sort of geographically segmented. We'll, of course, talk most today about the bolder China. But of course, we all know that in the second Trump administration, there's a lot of America First themes around trade, immigration, and other topics. We, of course, have the EU as sort of between the two major powers, US and China, and of course the global South, of which Chile is a part, playing, of course, a more and more important role in the global economy and taking on a much greater share of world trade as well. On the right-hand side, arenas of competition. I'll focus in particular on trade and FDI realignment, which I think is particularly important also from a Chile perspective, but also touch on some of these other areas, tech and AI, talent, of course, especially top talent. BCG has a top talent tracker where we're kind of watching how competitive countries are, particularly in AI, in attracting the world's best talent to their geographies. And then mission critical sectors, I think, are top of mind now with rare earths, of course, in the past year coming up again as China was considering to enhance export controls in that space. and those critical inputs being more and more important for sort of industries of the future, such as EVs and semiconductors. Climate divergence. Climate, I think, has fallen a little bit to the wayside in terms of just the global headlines, but remains very important just from an energy security and economic perspective, given the relative maturity at this point of battery, wind, solar, and other renewable energy industries. And so that still remains an important arena of competition, even if it's been de-emphasized somewhat versus say 5 to 10 years ago. Expanding conflicts is a more sensitive topic that I won't get into as much today, but we all know that in the US-China context, Taiwan, South China Sea, there are areas of geopolitical risk also in East Asia that perhaps we'll get into in the panel discussion, but I'll focus less of my remarks on here. So in sum, these are the 10 forces sort of geographically segmented and by arenas of competition. So let's dive into, in particular, Boulder, China, and the trade and FDI piece. On the Boulder, China, we always like to start with kind of this broad view, which is that in the longer arc of history, dating back really to, the time of Christ, we had a long period where China in the red there, as part of East Asia, was a very important part of the global economy, about a third or so of the global economy. We, of course, know in the Ming Dynasty when this peaked, China famously, had the Xixia where, they traveled on these large ships to Africa and other parts of the world to explore. And really that was a time when China was also opening to the world quite a bit. And then we had this decline. And of course, now we've had a resurgence in the last 30 to 40 years, call it. And so we're kind of returning to a place where we actually were for a long period of history, particularly prior to the 19th century. So interesting to think about US-China dynamics in that context as well. Now, diving into kind of what we see going ahead, I think it's important to note that China does add every 2 years the size of Italy to its GDP. And, it's contributing about 3x US to global GDP each year in growth. So although it's slowing as an economy, and, the 5% growth target, I might also quibble about how accurate it is given some of the statistical practices of the National Bureau of Statistics in China. But setting all that aside, even at these lower rates of growth, China is poised to add a substantial share of global GDP in the years to come, and different forecasts across IMF, World Bank, and Oxford kind of substantiate that. And again, that's something that we see through mid-century as a persistent trend. That being said, if you look at some of the challenges, I think they're well documented that China's economy has faced, particularly post-COVID. I think folks who are watching this panel will be quite familiar with most of these. But just to note that, the property sector, if you look at the house price index, still hasn't really recovered. You still have overall FDI somewhat anemic coming into the country. We see much more, robust FDI growth in some other emerging markets at this stage. And combined, of course, with more China's outbound investment as well. And of course, perhaps most importantly, despite internal demand stimulus, consumer sentiment in China is muted. There hasn't been as much of a rebalancing toward consumption as has been, I think, the aspiration of the Communist Party for quite some time now. And so what we're seeing as a result of that is a focus again on exports of goods, which is somewhat ironic given that in the 2000s, when China joined the WTO, export-driven growth was kind of the model. China began to transition out of that in the 2010s, but last year, exports accounted for about a third of China's GDP growth. This is very much sort of a throwback to what we saw in the 2000s. And so if we look more closely at exports of goods on the next page, go back to one page here. China's doing so now with an economy that's about 4 times the size that it was in 2008. So you look at exports to export to GDP ratio in a much larger economy. Not surprisingly, China today is the dominant trading partner for 92 countries, and that was already quite substantial in 2015, which is the left-hand panel. But in 2025, it's even more countries. And of course, we have Fortress North America. You see them in the top left of the map, where China is actually not the dominant trading partner for those 3 countries. And that's why the USMCA negotiations this year, et cetera, are really interesting to watch, and how Canada, for example, may pivot more toward trade with China again. But aside from North America, most of the world, including, of course, Latin America with Chile and Brazil in particular, China is a very important source of goods across a wide range of sectors, right? From lower value added exports all the way through high tech. And if you look at the high tech side in particular, I think it's important to note this that this slide shows you on the y-axis how much China has gained in export share in some of these more high tech industries, and the x-axis shows you the current share in 2025. And not surprisingly, in renewables, China is particularly strong and has continued to increase its share of global exports. But also increasingly in sectors like industrial robots, integrated circuits, we're seeing an increase in China's share of global exports as well. And again, this is happening, which is quite unique, I think, in history, alongside China still being relatively competitive in some lower value added industries like apparel, consumer staples, like toys and so forth, that are imported, say, by the Costcos and Walmarts of the world into the US. And so China really plays in so many different industries in global trade and is becoming very competitive also in these high tech sectors. Final slide on Boulder China, and then I'll go more into the areas of competition. I think it's important to note that, in terms of patent publications by technology, which you see here in this sort of stack chart, China in the light green there has really been increasing incremental to 2015 its share of global publications. And in many of these is now, pretty much the leading source of publications. In fact, it's probably the case for all of those sectors at this point. And one can kind of quibble over this, given that, issuing patents in China is perhaps a somewhat lower bar than in the US. But even setting aside sort of the quantity quality debate, I think it's fair to say that STEM talent in China and the tremendous resources the government has put into basic research and commercialization of research is reflected in these numbers as well. So China, slower economy, still very dominant in global trade, becoming more and more innovative in high-tech sectors, more and more competitive. How do we then think about this from the perspective of arenas of competition? BCG, as Loreto noted at the outset, has recently put out some publications on kind of how we see trade in 2026 and also forecasts through 2034, which I'll show you in a moment, of kind of the key flows in different corridors. To sort of level set how we think about this, we sort of see four major blocks: the US and China, obviously, and then what we call, I think, Carney actually at Davos, I think, called it the middle powers. We call it the plurilateralists, as sort of countries that are sort of middle to higher income, fairly open to global trade, and are kind of navigating a world of more geopolitical uncertainty, and sort of pivoting between the U.S. and China, and trying to create their own sort of plurilateral arrangements to uphold sort of a rules-based trade order at a time when, of course, the World Trade Organization has lost some of its historic influence. And then the BRICS Plus is sort of a separate category, given that's also a somewhat formalized block at this point that convenes on a regular basis. And so we have them as sort of a fourth block here. And then if we look at how this then plays out, this is, of course, a fun slide one can spend an hour talking about, but I'll keep it to a couple of key notes. If we look at these four blocks, you see the US on the left, China on the right, the plurilateralists, and BRICS Plus. Where we see growth through 2034 is really in the China's trade with the global South, and in particular, with the BRICS Plus. We see this, for example, in its robust trade with Latin America in commodities, which I think historically has always been a pattern, but is really picking up, for example, with Brazil with respect to soybeans and other agricultural products. And then we see also very strong growth of the plurilateralists with geographies other than the US. Because of some of the uncertainty now in the transatlantic relationship, we do feel that there'll be more and more pivoting toward the other places. And of course, we had expansion of preferential trade agreements that the EU is negotiating also with Mercosur currently, if it is indeed ratified by the European Parliament, as sort of part of that trend. I think where we see decline is really in the US-China trading goods. And interestingly, when we first made this chart right after COVID, when US had imposed the so-called Section 301 tariffs on many products from China, we had already forecast that there would be decoupling and a decline in trade. There was a lot of debate back then that was a very aggressive statement because, there was still, a very strong linkage. Even as China's share of US imports was declining in certain categories, overall trade was growing. But I think at this point, we're more confident in this projection given what we've seen in the last couple of years. And so we do see, especially when you consider tariffs and other export trade barriers that are increasing, that decoupling will continue. So that's kind of at a high level how we see global trade evolving. And I think the picture will look quite different by 2034 versus what it is today. And maybe a final note, if you look at the bottom right corner, total, global goods exports, we expect to increase by 2.5%, so just above GDP. And so we think that trade for the global economy, in spite of all the trade barriers and uncertainty we're seeing, will continue to have fairly robust growth, slightly outpacing global economic growth. Quick note just on FDI, which is kind of an interesting view as well. And this is a factual, backward-looking view. It's interesting to see that FDI into China by the European Union, by the US, has actually declined if you look at it sort of on a cumulative basis over sort of 5 to 6 year periods. And at the same time, China is making more outbound investments. And we see robust FDI growth also, for example, between the Gulf states and the global South. So from a US-China perspective, it's interesting to see that this dynamic of foreign companies going into China, making new investments, greenfield investments in particular, that's kind of a trend that's declining. And we're seeing more, especially when you think about China plus one strategies that companies are doing in Southeast Asia, for example, we're seeing more FDI into other emerging markets. So that's sort of our global map view of trade and FDI. Let me close here with just a couple of quick slides, and then I'll hand it back to the floor on some of the other areas of competition. Firstly, on tech and AI, I think it's interesting to note that the areas of relative competitiveness are, if you look at the blue there, US is very competitive on most of these metrics that's required for being competitive in Gen AI, except on the data front, and that's where China's particularly strong. I think the data center growth in China is a little bit unheralded, given that they have set up now in their energy mix, larger and larger share of renewables. They're using some of that renewable energy in some of the interior regions of the country to build data centers at scale at fairly low cost in terms of the electricity. And so China's using its infrastructure advantages quite well in the Gen AI space. And of course, what this chart also shows is that aside from the US and China, there aren't too many other geographies currently that are competitive across all of these different vectors. And it'll be interesting to see how those other countries differentiate themselves and pick a specific area, for example, the Gulf region in energy, where they can be competitive, knowing that US and China are going to be the leaders in this space for the foreseeable future. On talent, this...
Iacob?
Yes.
Sorry, may I interrupt you? Could you go back to the previous slide, please?
Yes, of course.
Could you point which is the line for the US? Because it's not that clear.
It's the dark blue shadow.
Yeah, okay. And what is the gray one? The gray area to which...
This is... This is the blue... The sort of what looks gray is the US.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what I wanted to clear up. Okay, thank you so much.
No problem, of course. This is an interesting page that has nothing on it aside from sort of numbers on the US and so no China-specific view here. But what's interesting to think about from a talent perspective is that the US relies heavily on foreign nationals, to work in its Gen AI labs. It trains many foreign nationals in PhDs in computer science and math. And so talent comes to the US, is trained in the US, often stays in the US to work in this space. In the current America First context, I won't get into the sort of more political sensitivities around that, but I think we all know that there's been some question marks around how foreign talent might feel working in the US. In the future. And so to the extent China becomes more competitive in this space, it'll be interesting to see how attractive the US remains as a place where foreign nationals want to work in AI. And the other thing to note on this slide, I think, is on the right-hand side, you see average salaries at leading AI academic institutions. And our study actually found that, postdoctoral fellows and associate professors in other countries that, using LinkedIn data that we pulled, you actually see fairly competitive salaries versus the US. And so countries are, and China is doing this as well, competing to attract talent with very attractive remuneration for those people. And so, as I mentioned at the outset, there's a top talent tracker that we have that's proprietary, where we kind of watch this. And the U.S. still remains a very strong net recipient of talent, but that's beginning to shift, and we think we'll shift more going into the 2030s. And then finally, just to end a little bit on the mission critical sectors, this is obviously a space that is being watched more and more as the U.S.-China dynamics develop, and China, for example, imposes more export restrictions. But when we think about mission critical sectors, it's important to note that the number of measures announced in recent years that impose barriers to trade or distort trade, such as subsidies, has really been increasing globally. And it's not just the US and China doing so, it's many countries. And that's sort of in conjunction with the dispute settlement function of the World Trade Organization playing perhaps less of a role in regulating world trade, and more countries kind of imposing measures that they find is in their national interest and aren't necessarily consistent with the sort of post-World War II global trade order that we've become accustomed to. And so this is sort of the global accretion of trade barriers. And when we think now how this specifically applies to the critical sector space, these are just some examples of areas where there's high geographic concentration of specific minerals. And this happens upstream in areas like lithium, rare earths, titanium, but also more importantly in the sort of midstream where China is really the dominant player. And we did a lot of work in the fall thinking about China's, the types of export restraints that China was beginning to impose. And what's notable about those export restraints is they weren't simply creating a simple export licensing regime for more rare earths. They were thinking about it also in terms of downstream products that are derivatives of rare earths. And they were imposing a licensing regime where the end user and the end use of some of those minerals was going to be part of what the government required companies to disclose in order to get an export license. So a much more stringent export regime that China was contemplating. Of course, they've put that on hold for now as the US and China negotiate this year, but it's really just a 1-year pause. And of course, China recently, with respect to Japan, has considered reimposing some of those export restraints. So, China's role here cannot be understated. It's part of a global trend of rising trade barriers, but here there's a particular choke point that can be quite impactful for the global economy. And then finally, on climate, I think the key takeaway here, if you look at the carbon intensity on the y-axis and electricity prices on the x-axis, you see that China plays quite competitively now in this space, with still very high carbon intensity given the sort of coal in its energy mix, but fairly low electricity prices, an increasing share of solar and wind, where we might argue the US currently is going in a different direction by sort of de-emphasizing sort of incentives for clean energy. And compared to China, still has fairly high electricity prices, which begins to matter when you look at, for example, the build out of data center infrastructure in AI. So I covered a lot of ground here, and happy to kind of revisit some of this content as we have our discussion with the group. But let me hand it back to the panel now in the interest of time. Thank you, Loretto. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you to you, Iacob, for this very interesting presentation. You had put forward so many things, so interesting analysis. The 4 nodes, for example, we're going to come back to some of the points that you reached, so to understand better. But now we're going to continue with Andrew. Andrew, please, if you have any slides to share. If not, you can just take the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Loretto. No slides on my side. Just a quick introduction. I know Loretto gave my bio from the beginning, but more of my company, Trivium China. We specifically look at China's policy functions, whether that be macroeconomically, bilaterally with the US, foreign policy towards the rest of the world, domestic policy towards, autos, tech, et cetera, et cetera. So we're very much a a policy focused shop. So I'm going to talk more from the policy angle. While we focus as a company mostly on Chinese policy, I will touch quite a bit on the US view. Being here in DC, I increasingly am an analyst of US policy towards China, even though my background is in China policy. By way of further background, I lived in Beijing for 10 years from 2010 to 2020. Made the mistake of traveling in January 2020 during the Chinese New Year when the pandemic broke out, and was unfortunately never able to get back to my home in China. So my family and I relocated to Washington, D.C., where we've been for the past 5 years, and have seen sort of an interesting evolution of China policy, or of DC China policy. Iacob touched on this briefly at the end of his presentation, but I would say, I was asked to talk about kind of what to expect in US China 2026 and implications for Chile and Latin America. Starting the year, we are in the best place we've been in US China relations. I would say, from my perspective, the most stable place, at least, than we've been in many years. And the reason I'm kind of hedging that is when I say the best place, I'm looking as an analyst and as someone who cares about stability between US and China. I'm looking for some level of positivity and some level of stability. I think are plenty of China hawks in Washington, D.C. that would say this is not a great place. We are being too soft on China. We need to maintain our aggressive stance. And yet, since the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in early November last year, it's now been almost 3 months since that meeting. In the immediate aftermath of that meeting, I think we had ongoing skepticism of whether or not the trade detente would hold, in large part because it's been consistent over the many meetings that were held throughout 2025 that the two sides continued to have differing perspectives on what exactly they had agreed to in their negotiations. But post-November, it looks as if both sides do have a fundamentally similar agreement on, or understanding of what they have agreed to. And so now we're almost 3 months into this year-long pause, and I think every day that goes by where one side doesn't jab at the other, the pause gets stronger and stronger. The ability of the pause to pursue gets stronger and stronger. So at this point, we would actually expect that this stability between US and China would last for another year. We actually think it creates a window of opportunity in some ways for companies to start planning for the potential next time strains in the US-China relationship do elevate, right? So we don't expect this to last forever. There will be hiccups, there will be misunderstandings, there may be more tariffs. We'll see what happens with the 232 trade investigations. But for now, there is this window of opportunity, and I sort of say that with a little bit of hesitation. Since the beginning of the year, the past 4 weeks, I've been talking about US China, and my overarching message is everything's kind of calm, and now's a good opportunity to start thinking strategically, which sounds strange to say in the context of so much volatility and uncertainty in the rest of the world, with moves particularly out of the US. And a lot of, I think the overarching feeling would be geopolitically, globally, that 2026 has started off in quite a volatile fashion. And yet US China would be sort of the exception to that reality. I heard one analyst say recently that he thinks about the quietness in US China. He has small kids. I also have small kids. And you sort of fear the quiet more than you fear the noise when you have small kids. If they're downstairs and everything's quiet, you're like, what's going on? They must be getting into something. So that's sort of it's an uneasy quiet in a way in US China. But I will say, um, from China's perspective, this is quite positive. They have never wanted the trade war. I will say, in terms of their approach to the most recent, uh, episode of the trade war, China was the only country in the world really that was prepared for what Donald Trump may do. They had been in a trade war with the US since 2018. There was a pause in 2020, but it never actually went away. Tariff levels were elevated, and they had the entire 4 years of the Biden administration to plan for what might happen if Trump came back in. And so I think that's pretty evident in their very methodical approach to responding to the Trump administration over the past year, not giving ground, very clearly laying out their responses each time they were hit by tariffs or other economic measures. And then, of course, as Iacob mentioned, having the big gun of the rare earths controls, ready and waiting when they really needed to ratchet things up. And so I think China was very prepared. They have played their hand pretty well, in my point of view, and have now achieved a stability, which is what they always want. China's leaders, I'm sure people know, number one thing they always want is stability. We do temporarily have that. I also think Chinese leaders believe they have bought some level of time. So I think fundamentally at this point, we've really moved on from the tariffs. The tariffs now between the US and China are kind of a sideshow. That's not the case in much of the rest of the world. The real action in US China is on these export controls. And Chinese, again, from our best understanding, the way the Chinese view this is that we're kind of in a choke point off, a standoff over various choke points. And that would be the US having the choke point over semiconductor technology, with those export controls being implemented in October 2022, and China having the choke point of rare earths production and processing, with those export controls having been implemented last year. And as Jakob mentioned, some of them implemented or put forth a very aggressive latest iteration put forth in October 2025 that was then put on pause in the wake of the Xi Jinping Donald Trump meeting. But I've talked to the Chinese embassy here in Beijing here in DC, and they mentioned, and I thought this was an interesting way to put it, their perspective is when it comes to semiconductor production, they have to go from 80% to 100%. When it comes to critical mineral production, the US and other Western allies have to go from 0% to 100%. And so they think they can close their 20% gap much more quickly than the US can close what they view as a 100% gap. And so within that context, buying a year at a time of stable US-China relations plays to their favor because they're sort of ahead in the choke point race. So that's, I think, a little bit of China's perspective. Let me also talk a little bit about how the Trump administration is viewing things. I think it's been quite remarkable. As I said earlier, there's a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who are not happy with the stability in U.S.-China relationship, or in the stability in the U.S.-China relationship. Donald Trump is seen himself as one of the most dovish people on China in Washington. Since the Busan deal, the Korea deal, we have heard multiple times from people in the administration. They want to characterize 2026 as being another 1979 when it comes to U.S.-China relations. And what they mean by that, of course, is 1979 was when the Nixon-Mao detente took place, right? And totally reshaped U.S.-China relations. Now, I don't think the Trump administration knows what they mean by we want this to be another 1979 from a practical execution standpoint, but it's remarkable that they are saying we want now to be a pivot point for stability, for improvement in U.S.-China relations. Remarkable thing that they're thinking. And so that's the overarching context that we come into 2026 with. I don't know if they've said that specifically to the Chinese, but it shows you where the intention is in the US government. I would say, in addition to that, we understand that the relationship has been streamlined, or the management of the relationship from the US side has been streamlined. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has now been empowered to manage and make decisions on the China relationship by Trump. I think now that the tariffs are not the main show, Donald Trump is less interested. Of course, tariffs are his favorite tool, and as he says, his favorite word. So that's now that that's less of the central aspect of the relationship, Scott Bessent has been trusted to move that forward. And that, again, is positive from the US side, in my view, in terms of stability, because everything now apparently has to go through him. And that means that the Commerce Ministry in particular is on a shorter leash. They cannot move through export controls without the okay of Scott Bessent in particular in the Treasury Department. And that's important because there's a lot of things that could blow up the very fragile detente between US and China. There's plenty of things the Commerce Department could do. There's plenty of things the Congress could do, which the executive branch of the administration has less control over. There's the 232 trade investigations, which have sort of some of which have concluded without any penalties, but sort of the administration has kept the potential for later penalties in its back pocket. So there's still plenty of landmines out there. But for those of you who may not know, the October export controls from China were really sort of what tripped them into action was the expansion of a sanctions rule in the US, the 50% rule or the affiliate rule, which basically made a bunch of export controls or the inability to sell goods to Chinese companies that were on a certain list expanded 20-fold because every subsidiary of the companies on those lists were suddenly put on the list. And the sort of scuttlebutt on that side is that the Commerce Department very quietly pushed that through, sort of undersold the implications of that move to the rest of the US government. Then when it happened, the Chinese felt like it was a broach of their previous agreement, got really mad, put in the rare earth export controls. So the kind of a long aside, but the point being that with Scott Bessent being the point man for the relationship, they're expecting those kind of sort of miscommunications or a US department going rogue to not be able to happen in the near term in 2026. So again, so again, it's the relationship's more centralized. There's a strong interest in stability among senior US officials in the government. And Scott Bessent has been empowered to make sure there's no sort of rogue officials that upend that fragile baton. So we're expecting quite a bit of stability here through November. Now, what goes on beyond that? Who knows? Will say I sort of like the idea that they have this yearly check-in, because when you have a trade agreement, as we've seen, any side can go back on it. The US in particular has been the one that has regularly gone back on its agreements, but usually you can get through a year, right? If it's open-ended, it's hard to maintain in perpetuity, but usually you can get through a year. So I kind of like that cadence. I think I'll end by saying just a couple of things I think so. US China has fewer near-term implications for sort of Chile, Latin American businesses. Like, things should be pretty stable. It's all the rest of the world that you have to watch out for. When I say a window of opportunity, I specifically mean we typically work with companies who have China-linked supply chains, and we do think those supply chains still need to be de-risked at the risk of future export and material controls from the Chinese government. So now that they're unlikely to put on many more export controls, at least vis-a-vis the US, because of this detente, it's a good time to try to diversify. I can get more into that in the Q&A if you'd like. But the other thing is the Venezuela piece, and I think there's been a lot of like that the U.S. stance towards Venezuela, I would say, is obviously much more impactful than U.S. China on Latin America, and there obviously is a China element. And I would just say, first of all, it's totally unclear what the U.S.'s Latin America strategy is, right? Is Venezuela the first domino, and there are more to come? Was the U.S. in and out, and now basically the Chavinista regime remains with with the leader now deposed, but the second in charge basically running the show, the overall government's still basically functioning. That seems to be the case. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be someone who's interested in long-term follow-up and pushing forward some agenda on that front. The only reason I say that is in the wake of that, when it comes to US-China, we saw a lot of commentary that this was a big blow for China in the region, right? And I'm just not sure that analysis holds, because it's too early to understand A, what's going to happen in Venezuela, and B, what the implications of Venezuela are for the rest of the US Latin America strategy. And my sense is actually that China will bide its time, continue to maintain its relations. Iacob showed the strong investment and export ties that China has built over decades and decades. It will continue to try to work with the Venezuelan leadership and the leadership of other Latin American countries. It's not going to be scared off by the US's actions unless a more aggressive strategy from the US government in Latin America starts to take shape. We just haven't seen that yet. So let me just kind of put that out there potentially for discussion later, and otherwise I will end my comments there. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you, Andrew, and also for the good news, apparently at least for a year. But we're going to come back to you with some of the points that you put through, like the good time to diversify for the companies. So we're going to come back to do that. Also about why do you expect so much from Scott Bessent? So, and also, why do you think that President Trump won't come back to the tariff play again? So just to give more details on that. But thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. And now we give the floor to Robert. I'm going to switch to Spanish. Robert, por favor, muchas gracias de nuevo y tienes la palabra.
Me van a perdonar, pero preparé mis notas en inglés y pensé que para la conversación con los colegas acá sería mejor hablar en inglés, así que puede depender de la bondad de la traducción. So I'm going to switch to English just because the discussion up to now has been in English and my notes are in English, so I thank the interpreter for that support. So I thought I would talk a little bit about how the US-China rivalry is impacting on Latin America and what it means for Chile in particular. And also because I think the way that the US and China are interacting or not interacting and negotiating, obviously it says a lot about how the new world order is being constructed, and therefore it has an impact on how we fit into this new order. The overall, I'm going to get a little bit political sciencey here. The overall, I think if you look historically, I think Joseph Nye, famous international relations scholar, wrote that if you go back, many of the great wars that broke out, from the Peloponnesian Wars in the 5th century BC to the First World War, broke out because there was an emerging power that was threatening the position of the dominant power, and so we seem to be in that kind of position now. That doesn't mean we're facing a war imminently, but it means that it's creating all this tension. And so what we're seeing in the reconstruction or the redesign of the international system is basically a redesign of how this current and future rivalry is going to play out. And Latin America will be affected by that and has a role to play in that. So one question is then, what are the United States and China doing in Latin America? And you can say that they're competing for resources. You can also say that there's an overlap of an intersection of interests. I think it was very interesting to observe how China responded to the national security strategy. It was quite muted, more than I get going a little bit what Andrew was saying about Venezuela, right? I think part of what explains that they're kind of calm is they're playing the long game, but also that it was clear that the national security strategy in laying out the Western Hemisphere as an American sphere of influence kind of leads the Pacific to China. And so China, I think, saw that, hey, this is they're not, this is kind of a green light, or at least a yellow light for Taiwan. So that shows a little bit how the American position in Latin America is just one example of how the American position with respect to Latin America informs how China will act in other parts of the world. The other point is that Latin American countries, because of the data and the reasons and the resources and everything that has been presented here, it's clear that Latin American countries have resources, have agency. We're not passive recipients. We're not only passive recipients of whatever the United States decides or whatever China decides. We have something to say in this. I'll come back to this in a minute. Those of you, my colleagues here, know better than I do how, to the degree to which Latin America, the degree to which China's economic involvement in Latin America has expanded from about 20 billion 20 years ago, 18 billion in the early 2000s to over 500 billion today. That expansion is obviously trade, it's investment, but it's also political, right? And it really comes from, I think you also have to understand, and this helps us understand this rivalry. What does the United States want from the region? What does China want from the region? A former American ambassador to Chile told me years ago that basically the main concern for China's leadership was to feed 1.4 billion people every day. And to feed 1.4 billion people every day, you need to have the economy grow. You need to feed the economy. You need to, right? So this desire to seek raw materials, to seek food supply, supply chains, not just for manufactured goods, but soy, right, is about literally feeding 1.4 million people every day. It's a domestic concern, right? China's global. Up to now, it may change in the future, but up to now, China's global strategy has been, we need to build a system that feeds this economy, which helps us feed 1.4 billion people. The United States, and that helps explain the Belt and Road Initiative, right? There's about 20 countries in the region that participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. The United States, of course, has different interests. The United States also has domestic concerns with respect to or domestic inspiration for its policy towards Latin America, and of course that it comes from migration and drug trafficking and of course markets for American goods. But the difference is, of course, American geographic proximity to Latin America. So it actually has not only a border with Mexico, but the maritime borders essentially gives it a border with other countries in the region, as we saw when the United States acted with these boats coming from Venezuela, which supposedly were drug trafficking. So the America's concerns and the issues that inspire American policy towards Latin America are very, very different from China. So it's not. So the rivalry is not really, do not come from the same places. Also, the United States cannot compete with Chinese companies in the region. The American private sector doesn't really maybe so far does not take orders from the from the American government, and so you can't really direct investment in the way that China can direct investment. And of course, the United States' role in the world is different with respect. American attention has to be placed in the Middle East, has to be placed in Indo-Pacific, apparently has to be placed in Greenland. So it's very difficult for the United States and China to really have a similar kind of approach or to compete in the same way with respect to Latin America. Given that, of course, what has tended to happen in Latin America is that countries like Chile, but also Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, have followed a path of diversification, right? It's not that we're choosing between one and the other. It's that we're trying to maintain a diversified foreign policy and kind of cooperating where we can, trading where we can, getting close to one and the other where we can, and up to now that has worked. It remains to be seen in the future how, especially if you take into account what the Trump administration has said in its national security strategy, it remains to be seen how viable that is in the future. But we also have to take into account that public opinion in Latin America, or at least in Chile, is very aware of the benefits of our relationship, our economic relationship with China, but also very aware of the risk, right? So we're very aware of it's good for jobs and so on. But Latin America is a region that has a history of dependency. We know it when we see it. We know what the risks are with dependency, with respect to debt dependency, with respect to what the possible environmental. We have centuries of experience with great powers exploiting our natural resources, leaving an environmental impact, leaving a social impact, crowding out local manufacturing, right? We have in small towns in Chile today, you go to the main street of any small town in Chile, and you'll see what they call a Chinese mall, right? Which is not really a mall, but it's a store that sells cheap Chinese goods, crowding out traditional local establishments. So we're very aware of that impact. We're also very aware that China's relationship with Latin American countries often involves support for regimes that we have tried to get rid of in the region. So we're also very, Chile just, I think this week or last week, canceled the Chinese observatory project, citing security risks. So we're very aware of the security and strategic risks that Chinese infrastructure and influence can mean on sea lanes, on ports, right, on all these sort of infrastructure projects, on utilities, right, on electricity transmission. And this is where a little bit my criticism of the United States approach comes in, because given these already existing concerns that we have, advantages with our relationship with China, but also concerns, the United States has positioned itself to be kind of just another great power that shares the same interests in the region in terms of accessing resources, critical minerals, and so on, and abandon whatever alternative economic, political, moral advantage it had as a model, right? The United States no longer seems concerned with that. And so if a country like Chile has to choose between two powers that basically offer the same thing, without the other side, without the political model side, then we're just going to go to whoever has the best offer, right? And that might not necessarily benefit the United States. On the one hand, clearly there's going to be deepening engagement with China. That's going to happen. That's going to continue. But Latin America, just like the United States, also needs to be aware of what the risks are and what the weaknesses. This week, what happened in China, right? The internal debates about we don't really know what happened, but clearly there's an internal debate in China about the country's military and political strategy, particularly with respect to Taiwan, which at the end of the day is also China's broader geopolitical position. We need to pay attention to that. We need to pay attention. In a country like Chile, which is a Pacific country, needs to pay attention to the Quad. The United States needs to pay attention to the Quad, to this alliance or cooperation between Australia, India, Japan. China's rivalry with India is a thing. Is something that will affect the broader geopolitical strategy, China's broader geopolitical position, just as the United States has been paying attention to Gaza and Ukraine. I mean, the United States, in a way, has abandoned the Quad because it's much less interested in the Pacific, maybe because of the stability that Andrew talked about, but it seems much less concerned with the Pacific than it is about trying to find a solution to Ukraine, trying to resolve Gaza, trying to make Greenland great again. So the United States needs to probably pay a bit more attention to our alliances, and also for countries like Chile, the Pacific and organizations or alliances like the Quad offer a space for building some sort of response to whatever the new system is going to look like. So, I think Mark Carney's speech in Davos was interesting for several reasons. But I think what he was absolutely right when he says that middle powers have the resources. They actually have power to, if they organize and if they realize that they have the resources to negotiate better terms, to seek diversified sources of capital, to protect their sovereignty. And a country like Chile, basically, the political science literature actually differentiates between middle powers and secondary powers. And the main difference between middle powers and secondary powers is agency, is the ability, secondary power is basically the global system says you are a secondary power. Middle power says we have a degree of resources, power, influence that gives us agency to do things in the world. That's what Carney was saying. That's what I think countries like Chile actually have. So, I don't think this is just to finish. I don't think this is a real. It's not only a narrative or only a story of a rivalry between the United States and China in the region. It's not a new Cold War. Again, my old friend Joseph Nye says, we don't have thousands of missiles pointing at each other like we did in the past. It's basically it's a very capitalistic story of competition for resources and agency and influence. And we have, rare earth. Again, like Carney said, we have the resources. I think he was talking about Canada. We have the resources that the world needs, right? We have, Chile does as well. We have rare earth minerals. We have renewables. We have a certain role in the international trade regime. And other countries in Latin America, even what look like problems like migration and drugs are a bargaining chip. The increasing role of geography, right? The Panama Canal is a concern for the United States. The Straits of Magellan, Antarctica, maritime routes, space. These are all things. Why did we cancel this? Why did we cancel this observatory? Space is an area of competition. We have those resources that influence on this relationship. And just to end, we are in a month or so going to have a new government in Chile. I think the challenge for the new government in Chile is particularly strong because Kast is someone who's going to want to reset Chilean foreign policy, move closer to Washington than we have been over the last 4 years. That's probably a positive thing. But also, the United States is a much larger investor in Chile than China is. But China is a much larger recipient of Chilean exports than the United States is. So, that's what Kast is going to have to navigate. That's what makes us a middle power, not a secondary power.
Muchas gracias, Robert, por tu muy interesante presentación.
Disculpe que en inglés.
No, está bien, no hay problema. Yo voy a hacer las preguntas para ti te voy a hacer la pregunta en español y voy a partir por ti ya que terminaste. Acabas de mencionar el hecho de que tenemos un nuevo gobierno con el presidente Kast recientemente elegido, que asume en marzo, solamente para que lo sepan Iacob y Andrew. Y ya estamos viendo algunas decisiones que indican que vamos a tener una relación más cercana a Estados Unidos o más pro-América, en Norteamérica, de lo que hemos tenido, por lo menos claramente en los últimos años con este gobierno. ¿Cómo crees que vamos a poder manejarnos? Porque hasta ahora Chile efectivamente ha tenido más bien una suerte de política de Estado, ¿no? De balancearnos entre las dos grandes potencias, Estados Unidos y China. Pero aparentemente esto parece que va a tener un sesgo un poco más claro ahora hacia Estados Unidos. Y teniendo en cuenta la reciente inversión que hizo además Estados Unidos, o que está haciendo, o va a hacer Estados Unidos en Perú, que no deja de ser tremendamente relevante, esta inversión en una área estratégica al lado del puerto de Chancay, que es la tremenda inversión que hizo China. ¿Cómo nos ves posicionados nosotros? ¿Cómo nos vamos a manejar ahora? ¿Cómo crees que vamos a manejarnos teniendo este gran socio comercial que es China, a quien destinamos, es nuestro principal destino de exportaciones hasta ahora. ¿Cómo lo ves en esta nueva
Yo
administración?
creo que la relación con Estados Unidos va a ser más bien política, es decir, y por eso también critico lo que ha hecho Estados Unidos, porque la fundación, los fundamentos de esa relación siempre ha sido que tenemos valores compartidos, ¿no es cierto? Con China tenemos intereses compartidos, pero con Estados Unidos tenemos valores compartidos. Y se hace cada vez más difícil decir que tenemos esos valores compartidos, pero todavía somos democracias, ¿no es cierto? Somos occidentales, tenemos ya. Entonces yo creo que la relación va a ser más bien política. Yo creo que no es difícil hacer un ajuste de lo que ha sido el discurso del gobierno actual, que ha tenido una actitud un poco, se ha manejado relativamente bien. Mantuvimos el visa waiver. Yo creo que esto es más bien gracias a la Cancillería que a la moneda, pero mantuvimos el visa waiver, evitamos lo peor de los aranceles. Entonces, lo navegamos relativamente bien, pero obviamente va a haber una mayor cooperación en lo político y en cosas como seguridad, drogas, migración, ese tipo de cosas yo creo que se puede hacer. En cuanto a comercio, yo creo que el futuro gobierno no se pierde. ¿Saben? Chile tiene una particularidad que no sé si se comparte en otros países de América Latina. Si uno le pregunta al Partido Comunista a dónde está nuestro futuro, con quién deberíamos alinearnos, van a decir China, ¿cierto? Pero si uno le pregunta a un empresario a dónde está nuestro futuro, a dónde deberíamos alinearnos, van a decir China. Entonces, eh, yo creo que el futuro gobierno no se pierde en eso. Nuestros intereses comerciales están ahí, eh, pero hay que manejarlos. Hay que manejar el tipo de inversión que entra de China, hay que cuidar los temas estratégicos. Yo creo que eso en un futuro gobierno va a ser un poco más cuidadoso de lo que ha sido hasta ahora.
Sí, y solamente para terminar en este punto, ¿cómo crees que Estados Unidos puede reaccionar a esta relación que tenemos con China y que además mencionaste también que este acercamiento a China va a continuar profundizándose? ¿Cómo crees que Estados Unidos puede reaccionar dada su nueva estrategia de seguridad nacional que mencionaste también?
Eh, Bueno, yo creo que Estados Unidos también, primero, yo creo que van a recibir positivamente el acercamiento, ¿cierto? Estados Unidos está muy consciente de que varios países de la región parecen estar haciendo un giro, o por razones políticas, o por simplemente el péndulo político, un giro hacia la derecha y hacia la esfera más norteamericana. Y eso lo van a recibir positivamente. Hay cosas que no son, por eso digo, yo creo que Chile le puede dar en otras materias más a Estados Unidos, más cooperación, y, y ojalá hacer ver que estamos diversificando también nuestros intereses económicos, o hemos diversificado nuestros intereses económicos. Eh, Eso es ahora. Hacia el futuro, hay que ver, ¿no? Mis colegas aquí en el panel han dicho, no sabemos cómo se va a ir desarrollando esta estrategia. Si se van a poner más duros, qué tipo de castigos van a implementar, eso no lo sabemos todavía. Al día de hoy, yo creo que todavía tenemos cierto espacio de maniobra.
Muchas gracias, Robert. I'm going to switch to Andrew. Andrew, we're talking about Chile's position and its trade towards China, etc. Can you elaborate on your point on the good moment for diversification against the backdrop of the U.S.-China relations? Because that could be Chile has been trying to diversify already its exportations, but maybe with this year it could be the best opportunity to continue deepening that. What can you elaborate a bit more on this?
Yeah, well, typically what I mean by that, and so it'll likely be less relevant, so I'll just touch on it quickly for folks on this call, is a lot of the companies we work with have supply chains in China, and this I think will be somewhat relevant in that companies that rely on Chinese supply chains specifically for anything in the critical mineral space, obviously rare earths, but we've seen controls on graphite, antimony. I'm blanking on some of the others, but germanium, gallium, there we go. China is going to be temporarily not putting additional controls on it. Will sort of, I think, selectively weaponize its controls. Iacob mentioned what's happening with Japan, but because China is unlikely to further evolve its export control regime over the next 9 months, say, and add new materials to that list, now is a good time for anyone who's sourcing anything that might be controlled next to start trying to find non-Chinese sources of these goods. Because what happens is when graphite is controlled, when antimony is controlled, everyone starts looking for non-Chinese sources. And that means you're competing with every other company in your space. A lot of this is consumer electronics. It also has a lot of these goods go into military uses, which is one of the reasons China controls them. So you're competing against defense industrial base, you're competing against the military itself, you're competing against other consumer electronics. And once a control comes on, everyone's scrambling to find new sources of supply. And demand skyrockets, prices skyrocket, but the supply doesn't come online quickly. So any company that's done the advanced preparation to diversify its supply chain, even marginally, to sources outside of China when it comes to the critical mineral space, will be in a much better position when inevitably another control happens, another kind of crisis moment happens. And that includes currently controlled items and other items that China will control in the future. So Chinese leaders have already indicated they will add when and if tensions rise again, they will add 5 more rare earth elements, light rare earth elements, to the export control regime, super hard materials, including cutting diamonds. And there's a further list that they will just go down piece by piece in terms of the main things that they control. So that's mostly a comment in terms of companies that are reliant on Chinese inputs, of which I'm sure there are many Chilean companies. When it comes to the export piece, this is more difficult. And I think I've talked to, so 2 years ago, I was in Australia doing a week-long trip with several other experts from the US, talking to various aspects of the Australian government. And this was still when the Australia, China, US was still quite strained, right? And Australia was in the doghouse, partly because they had called for a COVID investigation into China. Anyway, China was basically saying, we are not going to be importing beef, wine, a range of other agricultural goods from Australia. And it was really hurting Australian exporters. But then the government changed in Australia, a detente started to happen, and China started buying Australian goods again. And the government of Australia was very frustrated because the exporters that had previously been highly reliant on China, but had then tried to find other export markets when tensions were high, immediately went back into the China bucket. It went back to China for demand. And what I said to the Australian government, and I'd say it's the same thing here, is I always say, as a business owner, I totally understand that impetus. If your biggest customer goes away, you scramble and try to find other customers. But if your biggest customer comes back, you immediately start selling to them again. This is something that this has happened to us as a business, right? You're always worried about your biggest customer temporarily moving on, doing something else, becoming distracted. But as soon as they're there, you're happy to sell to them. And so governments often don't understand that diversification of export markets is a cost for businesses, especially when it's done purely for geopolitical purposes. If you're the only business that's diversifying, you're in a given industry, you are purposefully increasing your costs while the rest of your competitors are not. And that might serve you well on the chance that something bad happens and everyone needs to diversify at the same time. But in the meantime, you're bleeding cash and you're uncompetitive. And so when it comes to diversification of export markets, it 100% has to be government led. Businesses are not going to do that on their own because it doesn't make unit economic sense. And so I would say that's a message for government. If government wants diversification of export markets, it has to take the lead and incentivize and bear some of the cost. And then I would say increasingly, or additionally, for businesses, people on this call, that's a message you need to send to the government. If the government's coming to you and saying you need to diversify, the message back needs to be, well, you need to give us the roadmap and the resources to do it, because government actors don't understand this. They only think in geopolitical terms. They don't think in business cost terms. So hopefully those are some comments that might sort of clarify some of the diversification piece. One is on the supply piece, and then the other on the export thing is a little bit more complicated.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And actually, in the export side, the government or the state of Chile, there's a policy state towards diversification that has been taking in place, the last year. So we've been in this path for a while, supported by government policy. So we are kind of have prepared a bit the ground. Yeah, but still, there's a lot to do, and we're working hard to open new markets in India, Indonesia, Philippines, etc. And so part of the path has been done. I'm going to switch to Iacob. Iacob, are you expecting a significant increase in China's influence over the global South, owing to its boosted flows with those countries? If so, are you expecting any significant changes in US policies towards that bloc, the so-called global South?
That's a great question, Loretta. Let me answer it in two parts. So I think firstly, from a sort of more wonkish, one might say, global trade rule perspective, I think it's important to note that we're in a different place now than we were even a year ago, where I think historically, the U.S. Would want to negotiate preferential trade agreements with, other advanced economies, but particularly the global South. Of course, there's Chile, Peru, and Colombia, and Latin America, and then to a lesser extent, Southeast Asia, but that was certainly always an aspiration to arrive at certain, what we might call WTO plus provisions for very high standard free trade agreements. And then in conjunction with that, in Geneva, the World Trade Organization, of course, the U.S. was a very important participant in negotiating the current rules in the Uruguay round. And to the extent that free trade agreements, did not suffice, there were committees there, and the dispute settlement mechanism. Famously, the U.S. had some disputes also with Chile at the WTO. I was actually participating in some of those disputes under Obama 2 and Trump 1. So that's sort of the old world. I think the new world we're in now, from a trade policy perspective, is the U.S. is forging free trade agreements that are less high standard and more tactical, right? As we saw last year, forged quickly, not necessarily ratified by Congress, less ambition in terms of very comprehensive chapters. USMCA is perhaps one exception to that, being negotiated currently, but in general, that's quite different. And at the same time, the WTO, although coming up with the new ministerial conference 14 in a couple months, there are still some very important talking points on e-commerce, et cetera, but overall it's less influential. So that's sort of a different baseline. So when the U.S. engages with the global South, it's on quite different terms than that more conventional paradigm that we've become accustomed to. I think secondly, from a company perspective, well, of course, we work in this space quite a bit. What we've seen a lot since the so-called Section 301 tariffs were imposed by the U.S. on China in 2018 is a diversification of footprint by a lot of U.S. companies toward particularly the ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, et cetera, and by the way, a lot of Chinese companies as well that export to the U.S., right, making their final value add in those other countries to avoid some of those punitive tariffs. And that's sort of some might call that a China plus one, because a lot of the raw materials and IP still originate from China, but it arrives in the U.S. as a non-China origin product. I think the U.S. has become quite attuned to that this can be created a challenge and has already begun to take actions by, for example, in these bilateral deals with the ASEAN countries negotiated last year, where they said, in return for giving you only a 19% punitive tariff, not a higher rate that we calculated on Liberation Day, you'll have to agree that certain goods that are sort of transshipped from China, you will no longer allow. From a purely legal perspective, it's hard to argue what exactly transshipment means there, but the thrust is clear. The U.S. wants to avoid third countries becoming sort of a way for China to still access the U.S. market. And I think with Mexico, we're seeing this quite strong on USMCA, where we're likely to see provisions in that agreement that maybe disqualify certain goods from preferential tariffs if they have certain China origin content, or if they were made by a company that has majority owned by a Chinese company, for example, in Mexico. So I think that's sort of two ways in which it's changing. So the credential paradigm has been set aside, and the US is becoming very attuned to sort of this, what might call the transshipment problem. I think a final note is that the U.S. does listen to corporate America, and I think that the U.S. will continue to be the world's largest consumer economy with high import reliance, particularly in lower value-added segments that are more labor intensive. So there's some degree of I think pragmatism that will also set in eventually. You can't impose punitive tariffs on lots of countries because they don't want to accede to some of these demands and expect the U.S. consumer not ultimately to bear some of the brunt of that. We've seen a fairly muted pass-through of tariff costs so far. There have been some very good studies done on this by HBS and Northwestern and other scholars in recent months, but that's probably going to change going to 2026. We're going to see more impact of tariffs on the U.S. economy, and I think that will, to some extent, incentivize the government, the Washington, to be a bit more cautious in how it pursues its foreign policy in this space.
Thank you so much, Iacob. And well, I'm going to make you one of the questions that we have now in the Q&A. It says, Iacob, what role do you see for investment screening in the middle-sized economies like Chile regarding Chinese investments in infrastructure?
That's a great question. The CFIUS, the sort of U.S. authority under Treasury that has done foreign investment screening for national security concerns, has been around for a while. It was enhanced through the sort of so-called FIRMA legislation a decade ago, and there are CFIUS-like investment screening mechanisms being considered by other major economies. Japan, for example, is currently considering that. The EU, of course, investment regulation is done not at Brussels, but on the national level, so it's more fragmented, but Germany, for example, as well. The emerging markets have been more reluctant, I think, to impose those types of screening mechanisms, in part because it's the administrative capacity to do that is actually quite tricky. You have to do companies self-notify? If they don't, do you identify problematic investments? How do you investigate them? And so I think that's just also a perspective from Chile is, can you set up a CFIUS-like mechanism efficiently without disrupting too much commerce and just, making Chile an attractive place to do business? Another angle on this that's quite interesting is China, of course, has a free trade agreement with Chile that dates back to the mid-2000s after China WTO. And it's a quite ambitious agreement, but when it comes to the chapter on investment, it's not perhaps quite as in-depth as some of the US free trade agreements. And so if Chile were to do that, to what extent, imposing more of these screen mechanisms, how does that affect its existing free trade agreement with China? Do they have to update that agreement to reflect those changes? And I mean, I would say, it's always been for the Latin American economies, particularly Chile, Brazil, this challenge of taking advantage of the complementarities with China with respect to, for example, agricultural goods, copper, lithium, et cetera, and exporting those products, but increasing the value add of those exports and ensuring that if China invests in Latin America in those sectors, it does so in conformity kind of with local environmental labor laws, et cetera. And so I think that'll always be kind of a friction point. But I think Chile will probably always be cautious about imposing a CFIUS-like mechanism like the US because it's just a very different economy than the US.
Thank you so much, Iacob. And just to link what Andrew said with your views, he talked about this stability that it seems that it's going to last at least for this year, and he related to the possibility that Scott Bessent will have more control this year. What do you think about that? Do you share these views, or do you have anything? Because I'm going to ask Andrew to elaborate a bit more on this high expectancy from Bessent.
Yeah, so I don't want to get too into the U.S. Washington politics. I think Andrew's better equipped to do that. I will just say that when I was at USTR, there was always this bit of this game in Washington between the major agencies that handle some aspect of trade, right? The Department of Commerce does export controls. It does a lot of trade remedy tariffs. USTR does more trade negotiation, sort of trade disputes. And then, of course, you have others like DOE or DOD, et cetera, that also play some role. I think what's interesting in the current context is, as with the conventional paradigms in global trade, I think also how things work in Washington is changing quite a bit. And it's a different space, perhaps more concentrated decision-making around the White House and a more tactical approach to trade. And the Department of Commerce is therefore in an awkward spot because they have such a broad remit now. They do all the semiconductor export controls. They handle a lot of these Section 232 tariff investigations. So I think that they're simply doing what they're instructed to do in terms of this broad remit. But I think at the Treasury, they're thinking more broadly about the impact that some of those measures, such as export controls, has on the U.S. economy and U.S. foreign policy and the financial system. And I think that's where Besson comes in. And so I would agree that probably as now that we have so many different trade barriers in place, the economic impact becomes greater. It's natural that Besson would then become a more vocal proponent of exercising restraint and want to play a bigger role in decision making in that process. But Andrew, you're probably better equipped to answer this question.
Well, I will say Iacob put it very diplomatically, probably even more diplomatically than I would or will put it, which is to say that great point about just sort of the turf wars when it comes to economic policy, whether it be towards China or anywhere else. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen in terms of who wants to make policy. Typically, that process and that turf war is resolved through the National Security Council, which is sort of the concentration of individuals focused on, coordinating across the government in the White House. The NSC under the second Trump administration has been decimated, and arguably it was bloated before. There were too many people there, but I would say most people consider it to be now not functioning at all. And that leads to lack of communication across the government, disjointed policymaking, and the ability of various actors to go rogue. And we know for certain that the Commerce Department, with the affiliate rule, the 50% rule that they instituted in late September, that then prompted the reaction on rare earth controls by China, was very much done on purpose by Commerce and undersold to the rest of the US government as sort of a tweak to existing policy. So it was, hawkish people on China in Commerce, specifically in the BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security, that wanted to push this forward, purposefully kind of undersold the impacts, and now have been chastened because of that. Normally, that would have been sussed out through a robust NSC process where the interagency is coordinated. Because that's not working, I actually would say having Scott Bessent empowered on China, he becomes a de facto NSC interagency process, much more streamlined than normal, which arguably could be good. But at least there's a funnel through which all China decisions are made. Now, it does give Scott Bessent a lot of power, I would say, in terms of the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship, although I think he is acting under Donald Trump's, direction that he wants the relationship to be stable. And so I think that's the bigger background, is the government is not functioning as it normally does. The NSC process is totally broken. That has allowed various actors in DC to push their own agendas and created, miscommunication and lack of coordination among the agencies. And that's led us to this point where you need someone to be, crowned as the leader of issue X, in this case, Scott Bessent on China. So I think that's sort of where we are.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We're almost we are on time, but I just wanted to make very briefly, if any of you could, Robert, maybe, to talk about Taiwan. And there are two questions about it in the Q&A. And also, apart from Taiwan, I'm going to switch to Spanish. ¿Esperas cambios significativos en el acercamiento de China hacia América Latina, dada la política de Estados Unidos mucho más asertiva hacia la región? Solo esas dos cosas cortitas para terminar este webinar.
Formas tan relacionadas ambas preguntas, porque una de las cosas notables ha sido, mencioné en mis comentarios anteriores, el giro de algunos países de América Latina hacia la derecha, hacia más el mundo Trump. Eso también ha significado, pero por el otro lado hemos visto que algunos países han, digamos, ido abandonando Taiwán. Eh, y entonces el tema de Taiwán en América Latina y la forma que América Latina se relaciona con Taiwán dice mucho de cómo nos vamos a relacionar con China y con Estados Unidos. El tema de Taiwán desde China es interesante, no sabemos, como dije antes, qué es lo que ocurrió, qué es lo que ocurrió, tal vez Iacob sabe más que yo esta semana con la purga de toda la primera fila de generales y de plana mayor del ejército chino, las Fuerzas Armadas chinas. Algunos creen que eso tiene que ver con la orden que dio Xi de que China debería estar preparado para el 2027 para tomar acciones militares en Taiwán y parece que no se ha movido suficientemente rápido para lograr ese objetivo y la frustración de Xi se manifestó con esta purga. Esa es una teoría, ahora hay otras teorías que tal vez hubo un intento de golpe de Estado, no sabemos. Eh, lo que está claro es que el tema de Taiwán está presente, que Xi ha dicho que quiere pues, estar por lo menos militarmente preparado para tomárselo. Y como dije anteriormente, que yo creo que desde China se tomó el mensaje de la estrategia de seguridad nacional como un mensaje de que Estados Unidos en realidad no va a arriesgar nada para proteger a Taiwán en la medida que China deje el hemisferio. Ahora, hay una pregunta interesante, es, you know, can the United States afford to leave the hemisphere? ¿No? Sorry, China. Can China afford to leave the hemisphere? Es decir, China necesita los recursos que le da el hemisferio, por todas las razones que se han dicho acá. Entonces, no es tan sencillo simplemente decir, bueno, ok, dejamos el hemisferio a Estados Unidos y nosotros nos tomamos Taiwán. Taiwán no les va a dar cobre o soya. Eh, Así que, ¿y para qué hablar de los otros recursos, los otros minerales raros? Eh, Así que yo creo que ahí hay un juego que todavía está por verse, pero lo que sí está claro es que Xi está cambiando la política de China para una política mucho más agresiva. Esto es parte también del giro en el sistema internacional, donde la política exterior de China no es simplemente la expansión de sus intereses económicos, sino ya ejercer poder militar en el Pacífico. Y eso cambia mucho.
Muchísimas gracias, Robert. Hemos llegado, ya nos pasamos del tiempo. Les pido disculpas por eso a ustedes, panelistas que están muy ocupados, pero quiero agradecerles profundamente este muy interesante webinar. Muchas gracias, Iacob. It has been a pleasure to meet you. Also, Andrew, wonderful to have you with us, and Robert as well. Quiero informarles a todos los que nos siguen que el video y la presentación de esta actividad va a quedar en nuestra página web www.funpacifico.cl y los dejamos invitados para unas próximas sesiones sobre este mismo tema, dado el cambio tan rápido que se está produciendo todo el tiempo. Tenemos novedades y creo que un país como Chile efectivamente necesita estar muy atento a lo que está sucediendo, no solamente desde el gobierno, sino que también desde el mundo privado. La geopolítica ha pasado a ser un factor relevante en las decisiones que se tomen también al interior de las empresas e instituciones. Muchísimas gracias y que tengan un muy buen día y los esperamos por una próxima oportunidad. Muchas gracias.